My wife wanted to get rid of me. She cheated on me with another person and passed his son off as mine. When I ran away, her lover came after me and told me that she has cancer. When I left my hometown, I had no clue what kind of future awaited me. It felt like stepping into a dense fog, directionless but driven by the need to move forward. I thought I was abandoning a life of comfort, only to realize later it had been built on deception. With no concrete plan, I wandered aimlessly, unsure of my next steps until I stumbled across a small town that seemed just as lost as I was. The silence, the simplicity, and the potential for a fresh start had a strange appeal. In those early days, I yearned for a new beginning more than anything else. I didn't have much to my name, but at that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was distancing myself from the tangled mess I had left behind. I seized an opportunity that most would have passed over, a run-down gas station on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it gave me something precious, a clean slate. Far from everything familiar, I felt like I could finally breathe, rebuild, and find peace. The first thing I did was construct a decent-sized retail store at the front of the property, facing the fuel pumps. The idea was to cater to the town's needs after the local grocery store shut down at 7 p.m. every night. I revamped the gas pumps, converting them into self-service and relocating the underground storage tanks to make the pumps visible from the store. This change freed up an ample amount of parking space. Our busiest hours soon became from 7 p.m. until midnight. The convenience store was open 24/7, while the garage in the back operated from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. on weekdays. Sometimes, I came in on Saturdays for special projects or when a regular needed something. At first, the local bar wasn't too thrilled when the store began stocking basic alcohol, especially with beer and liquor sales. But like most small-town businesses, it didn't make me wealthy overnight, though it provided a stable income and a few much-needed jobs for the community. Each year, we managed to save more than many of the other local shops. The truth was, the town didn't offer much employment outside of farming, so most of the younger crowd left as soon as they could, seeking opportunities elsewhere. After a bit of restructuring and a few strategic moves suggested by a woman I hired to help manage the place, the business started doing even better. We paid off the investment I'd made into it and doubled the staff. Friday and Saturday nights became a blur of busy transactions, especially as we catered to those leaving the bar, eager to grab snacks and drinks to sober up before heading home. Sundays were great for selling cold beer, too, at prices that made us competitive. It wasn't anything fancy, but it worked. One Sunday evening, I found myself at the local bar, sipping on a double shot of Jack Daniels with a glass of iced water and a slice of lemon on the side. I had just finished working on an old truck in the garage behind the store. It belonged to one of the regulars, a vehicle that had been in his family since the 1940s. The steering column needed replacing, and it had taken me 8 months to find the right part. I even had to hand-make a few of the attachments. The man was proud of that truck, treating it like a member of the family. He always joked that he'd probably want to be buried in it if he had his way. Between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the evening was the best time to be at the bar. The regulars came in after dinner, and before long, the place would fill up with people looking for entertainment, especially once the band started playing. I had been living in this town for almost 6.5 years by then. In that time, I had built up a solid reputation and made plenty of friends. The locals here looked out for each other, and if something odd or unusual happened, word spread quickly. I usually only came to the bar once a week, always on Saturdays at the same time, for my single drink before heading home. It was my quiet time, a moment to reflect and clear my head. But this particular night, everything changed. I saw them walk in, and instantly, I wished I hadn't. They ruined what had been the perfect end to an otherwise good day. No matter how much time had passed, I could still recognize them. The woman was my ex-wife's twin sister, and the young man with her, well, I had once called him my son. Seeing them again brought back a flood of memories I had tried so hard to bury. It reminded me of just how blind you can be when you're living in the middle of a lie. The boy had grown since I'd last seen him. His features had matured, and his resemblance to his biological father was even more pronounced. It only reinforced what I had already known. The truth always comes out, sooner or later. But what were they doing here now? Why were they looking for me? They spoke to the bartender for a few minutes. I watched from the corner of my eye as the woman pulled out a photo from her purse and showed it to him. The bartender said a few words, and then they turned and walked out of the bar without so much as a glance in my direction. I was thankful for my long, unkempt hair, full beard, and mustache. They gave me a completely different look now, especially since I had shed the extra weight I used to carry. Nobody seemed to recognize me. As soon as they left, I pulled out my phone and sent a quick message. They're back. I'll be home as soon as I can. About half an hour later, the bartender, Tom, came over to where I was sitting. He pulled up a stool and sat down, looking serious. What did they want? I asked. They're trying to get a message to you, Tom said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Apparently, they heard a rumor you were living here, and they wanted to check it out. They said someone named Willa is dying of cancer and doesn't have much time left. They're looking for you because she wants to make peace. I stared at him for a moment before lighting up a cigarette. I didn't bother with the filter, ripping it off before taking a deep drag. The woman is my ex-wife's twin sister. The young man is her son, the one she pretended was mine for years. What do you think? Are they telling the truth this time? Tom leaned back slightly, thinking it over. They seemed sincere, I guess, but I don't know. They were definitely hiding something. Their body language wasn't right. I nodded, my suspicions confirmed. Willa and her sister, Tammy, had always been masters of deception. They knew how to show you one face while plotting something entirely different behind your back. Tom got up and returned to his post behind the bar, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I sat there, my mind wandered back to nearly 7 years ago, to the day I left. I remembered telling them that I wouldn't be back for 7 years, and I meant it. They had laughed at me, thinking I was just blowing off steam. To them, I was a fool, nothing more. But they learned the hard way that I wasn't joking. Back then, they had no idea that a few weeks before I left, I had discovered that our youngest child wasn't mine. He was my brother-in-law's son. That realization set me on a path I never expected to walk, leading me here. At the time, they had no clue that a family member had given me irrefutable proof. She had seen me get betrayed by Willa and Tammy one too many times and had finally decided to say something. To her, they were nothing but troublemakers, always practicing their own brand of deceit. I had uncovered even more than just the affair. Willa had taken out a new life insurance policy on me, with double indemnity for accidental death. If I died by accident, the payout would be $4 million. That revelation was the final straw. A family elder had warned me to get out of town, and fast, before things escalated. So, on the day I left, they had no idea that my truck was already packed with everything I needed from our 16 years of marriage. I didn't say goodbye. I just got into the truck, drove down the driveway, turned right onto the county road, and never looked back. By the time I stopped driving, I was 2 states away. Looking back now, I can admit that some of this mess was my fault. I was young and reckless when I got Willa pregnant. She was only 16, and I was 18, fresh out of high school. My family pushed me to do the right thing, so we got married that summer. Before long, we had 2 more kids. But I didn't see the cracks in our life until it was too late. They had laughed about what they had done to me. Willa had told our daughters, "Your dad will be back once he cools down. He really needs to learn how to take a joke." But they didn't laugh for long. A few hours later, Willa opened the door to a sheriff's deputy standing on our porch. "Are you Mrs. Willa Rhine?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, still chuckling, thinking it was all some kind of joke. "Ma'am, you've just been served," he said, handing her the legal documents. The moment she opened the envelope and read the divorce papers, the laughter stopped. That's when they realized just how serious I was. Through the grapevine, I heard that Willa was devastated to learn I had ended our marriage without a second thought. My lawyer and I had meticulously gone through everything: our assets, debts, and even a DNA report showing that our youngest wasn't mine. I had documented every detail of her year-long affair. The petition listed the times, dates, locations, and even the credit card charges for the hotel stays where she and her lover had met. We even had photos, provided by the family member who had decided she'd seen enough. Tammy had played a role, too, watching our kids so Willa and her lover could carry on their affair without interruption. and at my request, inside the envelope was a sealed letter. When Willa opened it, her sister, Tammy, learned that I was suing her husband for back child support and marital interference. That's when the reality of what they had done truly hit home. Their laughter had always been at my expense. They joked that the only thing I was good for was making money. Everything I touched seemed to turn to gold, and that had spoiled Willa and the kids rotten. They never expected me to fight back, let alone win. Later that day, Willa learned that I had sold the 3 businesses I had built from the ground up. I paid off all our debts, including the mortgages on the 2 apartment buildings we owned. I canceled all our credit cards and removed my name from the bank accounts. I had signed over my half of the house to her, took half of what we were worth in cash, and left them with the rest. The cash flow they had taken for granted, around $10,000 a month, was gone. Just like that, Tammy soon realized that her husband was also being taken for everything he had, thanks to the lawsuit. Before they even had a chance to react, their assets had been frozen. Once Tammy and her husband's divorce was finalized, they were left with nothing. My lawyer had even called Tammy back to his office to give her a small portion of what they had lost. She was stunned. "Why is he doing this?" she asked. "My client never cared about the money," my lawyer explained. "It was always about the principle, something you and your sister clearly lack. By giving you this money, he hopes you'll learn from this experience and have a chance to start over." Willa, of course, refused to finalize the divorce until she had a chance to speak to me in person. But I had no interest in talking to her. We remained legally separated for years. Willa, for the first time in her life, had to work to support herself and the kids. Money, as she quickly learned, disappears fast when there's none coming in. To make sure I stayed far away from their drama, my lawyer forwarded all important documents to a mailbox I rented in another state. I did everything in my power to keep them from tracking me down. As the years went by, I settled into a quiet routine in the small town. Life had moved on, or so I thought. That was until the day Tammy and the boy showed up at the bar, kicking up dust from a past I had worked so hard to leave behind. I knew better than to think they'd just disappear. When Tom mentioned that Willa was dying, it stirred something inside me. After all, she had been my wife for 16 years. But I also knew better than to trust that it was the whole truth. With Willa and Tammy, there was always something more lurking beneath the surface. I finished my drink, left a tip on the counter, and headed out the back door of the bar. I knew better than to walk out the front where they might be watching. I slipped through the back alley, taking a circuitous route to my truck. Once I was certain no one was following me, I unlocked the door and climbed in. I sat there for a moment, turning the key in the ignition, but I didn't pull out right away. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what their game was this time. Willa was dying of cancer, or so they claimed. But why now? Why try to find me after nearly 7 years of silence? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another one of their tricks. Maybe Willa was dying, but with them, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. I drove home, still deep in thought, replaying Tom's words over in my mind. I pulled into the driveway of my house, parked the truck, and sat there for a while longer, staring out at the quiet, moonlit yard. When I finally stepped out of the truck, the cool night air hit me, snapping me out of my thoughts. As I walked up to the house, I could hear the familiar sound of little feet running toward the door. My 2 kids, ages 3 and 4, burst out of the house, shouting, "Daddy!" They clung to my legs, their laughter filling the evening air. No matter how complicated my past was, these 2 little ones made everything worth it. "Go wash up. Dinner's almost ready," my wife, Jody, called from the doorway. She stood there, arms crossed, her blue eyes sparkling with warmth and a hint of curiosity. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she added with a teasing smile. I bent down, kissed my children on their heads, and sent them inside. As I walked up to Jody, she could sense something was off. I hadn't told her about Willa, Tammy, or the past I had left behind in Paradise, the town I had once called home. I had kept that part of my life tucked away, like an old wound that had mostly healed but still ached from time to time. "Everything okay?" Jody asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Yeah, just some old memories," I replied, brushing it off. "Let's eat. I'm starving." She gave me a knowing look, but didn't push further. That was one of the things I loved about Jody. She knew when to press and when to let things be. I followed her inside, where the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. We sat down as a family, the kids giggling and chatting about their day. For a moment, I allowed myself to forget about the past, focusing instead on the simple joy of being with my family. Later that night, after the kids were tucked into bed, I stood in the bathroom, staring at myself in the mirror. My beard had grown wild, and my hair was long and unkempt. I barely recognized the man looking back at me. 7 years had changed me in more ways than just appearance. I had built a new life, far from the mess that had once defined me. But Tammy showing up meant that life was about to get complicated again. I grabbed the clippers from the bathroom drawer and started trimming my beard, leaving it as stubble. By the time I was done, I looked more like the man I used to be and less like the stranger I had become. Jody walked in, catching me mid-shave. "Whoa, what's the occasion?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I shrugged. Just felt like cleaning up a bit. Thought it was time. She studied me for a moment, her lips curving into a smile. "Well, I like it. You look good. Different, but good." I chuckled softly, leaning in to kiss her. "Thanks." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what their angle was this time. If Willa was truly dying, maybe she wanted to make amends before it was too late. But it was hard to believe that after everything she and Tammy had put me through, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were up to something more. The next morning, I decided to take a trip to the only person who might know more about what was going on. Josie, Jody's grandmother. She had always been a sharp woman, with a knack for understanding people. Josie was the one who had helped me when I first left Paradise, giving me a place to stay and helping me get back on my feet. She had been a rock for both me and Jody when things were at their darkest. I drove out to her place, a small farmhouse nestled on the edge of town. The drive was peaceful, the rolling hills and open fields offering a sense of calm that I desperately needed. When I arrived, Josie was sitting on her porch, knitting, her gray hair tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. Well, look who's finally cleaned up," she said with a grin as I walked up to the porch. I smiled, taking a seat beside her. "Figured it was time. Got something on my mind." "Uh-huh. I could tell the moment you pulled up." "What's going on?" she asked, setting down her knitting and turning to face me. "Tammy showed up in town yesterday. With Willa's son." Josie's eyes narrowed. "What do they want now?" "They claim Willa's dying of cancer. They're trying to find me, saying she wants to make peace before it's too late." Josie let out a long, slow sigh. "And you think there's more to it?" "I know there's more to it. There always is with them. They never do anything without an ulterior motive." Josie nodded, leaning back in her chair. "You're right to be cautious. Those two have been scheming since the day they were born. But if Willa is dying, there's a chance she might actually want to set things straight. It's not unheard of, people wanting to make amends when they're facing the end." "I don't know," I muttered, running a hand through my freshly trimmed hair. "It just doesn't feel right." Josie was quiet for a moment, staring out at the fields before she spoke again. "If I were you, I'd find out the truth. But don't go in there blind. You need to protect yourself. Willa and Tammy aren't the type to just let things go. If they want something from you, they'll play every card they have to get it." "I've thought about that," I replied. "But what if she really is dying? What if this is my only chance to put it all behind me?" Josie turned to me, her sharp eyes locking onto mine. "Then you go, but you go on your terms. You've spent too many years letting them control the narrative. This time, you take control." Her words hit me hard. She was right. I had been running for too long, letting the past dictate my present. Maybe it was time to face it head-on, but I would do it my way. I wasn't the same man who had fled Paradise all those years ago. I had built a new life, and I wasn't about to let them take that from me. "Thanks, Josie," I said, standing up and giving her a hug. "I'll figure it out." She patted my back. "I know you will. And if you need anything, you know where to find me." I left Josie's house feeling a little more grounded, but still unsure of what my next move should be. I couldn't ignore the possibility that Willa was genuinely sick, but I also couldn't shake the suspicion that Tammy had something else up her sleeve. I decided to take a drive into town, figuring I might be able to gather more information. When I pulled into the small grocery store in the center of town, I saw Tom standing outside, chatting with a few of the locals. He spotted me and waved me over. "Hey, Art," Tom said as I approached. "You hear any more from those two?" I shook my head. "Not yet, but I'm working on it." "You hear anything?" Tom scratched his chin, glancing around before leaning in closer. "I heard a rumor that they've been staying over at the old motel on the edge of town. Willa's not with them, though. It's just Tammy and the boy." My heart rate quickened. So, Willa wasn't even here. That confirmed part of my suspicion. Why would they be looking for me if Willa wasn't with them? "You sure?" I asked. "Yeah. I talked to a guy who works there. Said they've been there for a couple of days, asking around about you." "Thanks, Tom," I said, feeling a mixture of relief, and I left Tom standing outside the grocery store, his words echoing in my mind. Willa wasn't with them. That meant this whole thing wasn't just about her being sick. It was something more. I could feel it in my gut, a gnawing suspicion that whatever Tammy was planning, it wasn't about making peace. It was about control, the same control she and her sister had tried to exert over me for years. As I drove away from town, I debated what to do next. Part of me wanted to march straight over to the motel and confront them, get the truth out in the open. But the smarter part of me knew that wasn't the right move. Not yet, anyway. I needed more information before I made my next move. Instead of heading home, I found myself driving out toward the old cabin I kept just outside town. It wasn't much, a simple structure I'd fixed up after I left Paradise, but it was private, tucked away in the woods where no one could bother me. I kept it for moments like this, when I needed space to think and figure things out. The sun was setting as I pulled up to the cabin. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground, and the air was cool and quiet. I got out of the truck, grabbed a beer from the cooler in the back, and sat down on the porch steps, staring out at the woods. I had been here many times before, but tonight felt different. I could sense something shifting, something that had been set in motion the moment Tammy walked into that bar. I took a long swig of the beer, letting the cold liquid wash away some of the tension that had been building inside me. As I sat there, my thoughts kept circling back to Willa. If she really was sick, why wasn't she here? Why send Tammy and the boy instead of coming herself? The more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. Willa wasn't the type to let anyone else do her dirty work, especially not Tammy. And then there was the boy. The last time I had seen him, he was just a kid, still small and quiet, unsure of himself. Now he was older, and from what Tom had said, he was starting to look more like his real father. I had raised that boy for years, thinking he was mine, only to find out the truth after I left. It had been one of the hardest things to accept, that the life I had built was built on a lie. And yet, I had cared for him, loved him as if he were my own. Seeing him again now, after all this time, stirred up a mix of emotions I wasn't sure how to handle. I sat there for a long time, watching the stars come out one by one. I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me, heavier than it had been in years. But I also knew that I wasn't the same man I had been back then. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up, and I wasn't about to let Tammy or Willa drag me back into their mess. By the time I finished my beer, I had made up my mind. I was going to confront them, but I was going to do it on my terms. No more running. No more hiding. I had spent too long looking over my shoulder, and I was done with that. If they wanted something from me, they were going to have to face me head-on. The next morning, I woke early, the resolve from the night before still strong in my chest. I kissed Jody goodbye and told her I had some things to take care of in town. She gave me a curious look, but didn't ask too many questions. That was another thing I appreciated about her. She trusted me to handle my business, even when I didn't explain everything. I drove back into town, heading straight for the motel Tom had mentioned. It wasn't hard to find. It was the kind of place you could pass by 100 times and never notice, a rundown spot just off the highway, with a flickering neon sign that looked like it hadn't been fixed in years. I pulled into the gravel lot and parked near the back, keeping my truck out of sight from the main road. I got out and walked toward the office, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe Tammy and the boy sitting in the lobby, waiting for me. But when I opened the door, the place was empty except for the man behind the counter, who looked up from his newspaper as I walked in. "You looking for a room?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. Actually, I'm looking for some people. They're staying here, woman and a young man, probably checked in a couple of days ago. The man eyed me warily, clearly not eager to give out information. I don't know about that, he said. We don't give out details on guests. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a few bills, sliding them across the counter. I just need to know if they're still here. The man hesitated for a moment, then pocketed the money and leaned forward, lowering his voice. Room 12. They're still here. Haven't seen much of him, though. Just come and go every now and then. Thanks, I said, turning and heading back outside. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, staring at the door to room 12. It was at the far end of the lot, the blinds drawn tight, no sign of life inside. I took a deep breath and walked over, my boots crunching on the gravel with each step. When I reached the door, I paused for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. Part of me wanted to turn around and walk away, but I knew I couldn't. Not anymore. I knocked, 3 quick raps on the door, and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, I heard movement inside, a shuffle of feet, and the door creaked open just a crack. Tammy's face appeared in the gap, her eyes narrowing when she saw me. Well, look who finally decided to show up, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Come to check on your dying ex? I didn't rise to the bait. I want answers, Tammy. Is Willa really sick, or is this just another one of your games? She opened the door wider, leaning against the frame with a smirk. Why don't you come inside and find out for yourself? I stepped past her into the room. It was small, dingy, with a couple of twin beds and a tiny table near the window. The boy was sitting on one of the beds, his head down, avoiding eye contact. I looked at him for a moment, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. He was as much a victim of Willa's lies as I had been. So? I said, turning back to Tammy. What's the truth? She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. The truth is, Willa's got cancer. Stage 4. She's not got much time left. She's in the hospital back in paradise. And why didn't she come here herself? Why send you? Tammy shrugged. She's too weak to travel. But she wanted to see you before, before it's too late. I studied her face, trying to read between the lines. There was something off about her tone, something that didn't quite add up. But before I could press her further, the boy finally spoke up. It's true, he said, his voice low. She's sick. I've seen her. She wanted to come, but she couldn't. I turned to him, my anger softening a little. He looked older than I remembered, his face more mature, but there was still a hint of the boy I used to know. What do you want from me? I asked. The boy hesitated, glancing at Tammy before answering. She wants to make peace. She said she needs to apologize to you, face to face, before she dies. I stood there, processing his words. If Willa was really dying, if she really wanted to make amends, then maybe I owed it to myself to hear her out. But part of me still didn't trust any of it. Why should I believe you? I asked, looking from the boy to Tammy. After everything you two have pulled, why should I believe a word you're saying? Tammy's smirk faded, and for the first time, she looked a little uncomfortable. Look, I get it. We've screwed up. But this isn't about me. It's about Willa. She's dying, Art. Whether you believe me or not, she doesn't have much time. I stared at her for a long moment, weighing my options. If Willa really was dying, maybe this was my chance to finally put the past behind me. But I wasn't going to walk into another one of their traps without knowing more. All right, I said finally. I'll go see her. But I'm not doing it on your terms. I'll go when I'm ready. Tammy opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. No more games, Tammy. If she really wants to make peace, then fine. But I'm not jumping through hoops for you. She closed her mouth, her expression tightening, but she didn't push back. Fine, she said, but don't wait too long. She doesn't have much time. I nodded, then turned to leave. As I reached the door, the boy called out after me. Art. I paused, glancing back at him. Yeah, thanks for coming. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and walked out, letting the door close behind me. As I stepped back into the sunlight, I felt a strange sense of relief. At least now I had some answers, even if they weren't the ones I wanted. But there was still a long way to go before this was over. The drive back to my house was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound in the cab. My mind was racing, trying to figure out my next move. If Willa really was in the hospital, if she really was dying, then I needed to decide whether or not I wanted to see her before it was too late. Part of me wanted to stay as far away from paradise as possible, to keep the distance I had worked so hard to create. But another part of me, the part that remembered the good times, the early years before everything went wrong, felt like I owed her at least one final conversation. When I pulled into the driveway, Jody was outside, playing with the kids. She looked up as I got out of the truck, shielding her eyes from the sun. "You okay?" she called out. I forced a smile, walking over to her. "Yeah, just had to deal with some old ghosts." She studied my face, her eyes filled with concern. "You want to talk about it?" "Not yet," I said, wrapping my arms around her and pulling her close. "But soon." We stood there for a moment, holding each other, the sounds of our children laughing in the background. It was a peaceful scene, a sharp contrast to the storm that was brewing inside me. I knew that whatever decision I made, it was going to affect not just me, but my family too. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on work, keeping my mind busy with the tasks at the gas station and the store. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the thought of Willa lying in a hospital bed, waiting for me to show up. It felt like a clock was ticking, counting down the days, and I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. One afternoon, after I had finished fixing a customer's car, I sat in the office, staring at my phone. I had the number for the hospital back in Paradise, but I hadn't called it yet. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Maybe a sign, something to tell me that this was the right thing to do. But deep down, I knew that if I didn't go, I would regret it for the rest of my life. Finally, I picked up the phone and dialed the number. The voice on the other end was polite but distant, asking how they could help me. "I'm calling to check on a patient," I said, my voice feeling strange in my own ears. "Willa Rhine." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of typing. "Yes, she's here," the woman said finally. "Would you like to be connected to her room?" For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to hang up, to forget the whole thing. But I couldn't. "Yes, please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a click, and then the sound of a phone ringing. It rang twice before someone picked up. For a moment, there was silence, and then a weak voice came through the line. "Hello?" It was Willa, and for the first time in nearly 7 years, I felt like I was being pulled back into a world I had tried so hard to leave behind. The sound of Willa's voice on the other end of the line hit me like a punch to the gut. It was weak, frail, barely more than a whisper, and yet it carried with it the weight of all those years we had spent together, all the memories, both good and bad, rushing back at once. I hadn't heard her voice in nearly 7 years, and now, here she was, sounding like a ghost of the woman I once knew. "Hello?" she repeated, her voice crackling through the phone. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. What do you say to someone who betrayed you in every way possible? What do you say to a person who lied to you, hurt you, and destroyed the life you thought you had? But then, something in her tone softened me, reminded me that she was still human, still the mother of my children. And maybe, just maybe, she really was dying. "It's me," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "It's Art." There was a long pause on the other end. For a moment, I thought she had hung up, but then I heard her breath catch, like she was struggling to find the words. "Art," she whispered, the sound of my name shaky in her voice. I didn't think you'd call." "I wasn't sure I would," I admitted, leaning back in my chair and running a hand through my hair. "But here I am." She was quiet again, and in the silence, I could hear the faint hum of machines in the background. I could picture her lying there, hooked up to monitors, surrounded by sterile white walls. It was a far cry from the woman I remembered. Strong, confident, manipulative, but I couldn't forget that there had been a time when I had loved her. I had given her everything, and for years, I thought she had given me the same. "I need to see you," Willa said, breaking the silence. "I don't have much time left. Please, Art. I need to talk to you. I need to explain." The raw vulnerability in her voice gave me pause. This wasn't the Willa I knew. The Willa I remembered never asked for anything. She demanded. She manipulated. She controlled. But she never pleaded. And yet, here she was, asking me to come to her. I don't know if I can do that, I said honestly. After everything. I know, she interrupted, her voice cracking with emotion. I know I've done terrible things. But please, if you could just give me this one chance. I need to make things right. Before it's too late. I closed my eyes, leaning forward in my chair and resting my elbows on my knees. I had spent the last 7 years trying to forget Willa, trying to rebuild my life without the weight of her betrayal hanging over me. But as much as I tried to bury the past, it always had a way of creeping back up. And now, here it was, staring me in the face. Where are you? I asked, my voice low, resigned. She let out a shaky breath, like she had been holding it in, waiting for me to say those words. I'm at the hospital in Paradise, she said. Room 302. Paradise. The place I had vowed never to return to. It was the town where everything had fallen apart, where I had lost everything. But it was also the place where I had built my life, where I had raised my kids. And now, it seemed, it was the place I would have to return to one last time. I'll think about it, I said finally, not committing to anything just yet. I needed time to process, to figure out if I was ready to face Willa and everything that came with her. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't deserve it, but thank you. I ended the call and sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, staring at the floor. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. Seeing Willa again felt like reopening an old wound, one that had never fully healed. But maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to finally get closure, to put the past behind me once and for all. Later that evening, as I sat on the porch of our house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jody came out and joined me. She handed me a glass of iced tea and sat down beside me, her eyes searching my face for answers. You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders, she said softly, taking a sip of her tea. I sighed, leaning back in my chair and staring up at the sky. I talked to her, I said finally. Willa? Yeah. She wants to see me. She says she's dying. Jody didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there, letting the words sink in. Then, she reached over and placed her hand on mine, her touch warm and comforting. How do you feel about that? She asked gently. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me feels like I should go, like I owe it to myself to hear what she has to say. But the other part of me, I just don't want to reopen all of that. I've worked so hard to move on, and now? You're scared it'll pull you back in, Jody finished for me. I nodded, grateful that she understood without me having to explain it all. You don't owe her anything, Art, Jody said firmly. But if you think this will give you the closure you need, then maybe it's worth it. Just make sure you're doing it for you, not for her. I turned to her, taking her hand in mine. How did I get so lucky to find you? She smiled, squeezing my hand. I ask myself the same thing every day. For the next few days, I wrestled with the decision. I went about my business at the gas station, worked on cars in the garage, and spent time with Jody and the kids, but in the back of my mind, Willa's voice echoed. I could still hear the desperation in her tone, the fear that time was running out. In the end, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. If I didn't go, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. So, one morning, I packed a small bag, kissed Jody and the kids goodbye, and got in my truck. The drive to Paradise wasn't long, but it felt like it took forever. Every mile that brought me closer to that town brought back memories I had tried so hard to forget. I hadn't been back to Paradise since the day I left. The last time I saw it, I was driving away with everything I owned packed into the back of my truck, vowing never to return. Now, here I was, breaking that promise. The town looked the same as it always had, a little run down, but still clinging to life. The main street was quiet, with a few cars parked along the sidewalks, and the same old stores lined the road. It was as if time had stood still here, while everything else in my life had moved forward. I drove past the old house, the place where Willa and I had raised our kids. It looked different now. Someone else had moved in, and they had painted the shutters a different color. The yard was overgrown, and the swing set we had bought for the kids was gone. It was strange to see it like that, like a piece of my past had been erased. Finally, I reached the hospital. It was a small, unassuming building, the kind you'd expect to find in a town like Paradise. I parked the truck and sat there for a moment, staring at the entrance. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for a second, I thought about turning around and leaving. But I couldn't. Not after coming this far. I got out of the truck, walked through the sliding glass doors, and approached the front desk. A nurse looked up from her computer, giving me a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to see Willa Rhine." "Room 302, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. The nurse nodded, checking her computer. "Third floor, to the right. Visiting hours are until 8. I thanked her and made my way to the elevator. As I stood there, waiting for the doors to open, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a different world, one I had left behind but never fully escaped. The elevator ride felt like an eternity, the soft hum of the machinery the only sound in the small space. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out onto the third floor and followed the signs to room 302. My footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway, and with each step, the weight of what I was about to do pressed down on me. When I reached the door, I paused, my hand hovering over the handle. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before pushing it open. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn to block out the afternoon sun. Willa was lying in the bed, her face pale and gaunt, her once vibrant red hair now thin and gray. She looked up as I entered, her eyes widening in surprise. "Art," she whispered, her voice weak but unmistakable. "You came." I stood there for a moment, just staring at her. She looked so different from the woman I had once known. The years hadn't been kind to her, and the illness had taken its toll. But despite everything, I could still see traces of the Willa I had once loved. "I wasn't sure if I would," I admitted, walking over to the chair by her bedside and sitting down. "But here I am." She smiled, a faint, sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I didn't think you'd come," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But I'm glad you did." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened between us hanging in the air. I didn't know where to start. There was so much I wanted to say, so much I needed to understand. But before I could speak, Willa beat me to it. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said, her voice trembling. "I've done terrible things, things I can't take back. But I need you to know that I'm sorry, Art. I'm so sorry." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so many years building up walls, protecting myself from the pain she had caused, that hearing her apology felt like someone had cracked those walls wide open. "Why now?" I asked, my voice tight with emotion. "Why are you telling me this now?" Tears filled Willa's eyes, and she looked down at her hands, which were trembling in her lap. "Because I don't have much time left, and I can't leave this world without trying to make things right. I know I hurt you. I know I destroyed everything we had, but I never stopped loving you, Art. Not really." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. For so long, I had believed that everything between us had been a lie, that she had never truly cared about me. And yet, here she was, telling me that she had loved me all along. "I don't understand," I said, my voice cracking. "If you love me, why did you do it? Why did you lie to me for all those years?" Willa's face crumpled, and she wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know," she whispered. "I was scared. I was young, and I made stupid decisions. And once I started lying, I couldn't stop. It was like I was trapped in this web I'd created, and the more I tried to fix it, the worse it got. By the time I realized how much I'd hurt you, it was too late." I sat there, stunned, as her words sank in. All this time, I had thought I knew the truth about what had happened between us. But now, hearing her side of the story, I realized that things were more complicated than I had ever imagined. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice filled with frustration. "Why wait until now, when you're on your deathbed?" Willa looked at me with tear-filled eyes, her voice trembling. "Because I was a coward," she admitted. I didn't want to face the consequences of what I'd done. I didn't want to lose you. And by the time I realized I had already lost you, I was too ashamed to admit it. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. For so long, I had carried this anger, this resentment toward Willa, believing that she had never truly loved me. And now, in the final moments of her life, she was telling me that she had loved me all along, that she had been trapped by her own mistakes. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I understand, Willa replied, her voice soft. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope you can find it in your heart to let go of the anger, even if it's just for your own sake. I didn't say anything for a long time. I just sat there, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of everything. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to let go of the pain I had been carrying for so long. But another part of me still felt the sting of betrayal, the weight of everything I had lost because of her. I'll try, I said finally, my voice rough with emotion. I'll try to let it go. Willa smiled through her tears, her face softening with relief. That's all I can ask for, she whispered. We sat in silence for a while, the room filled with the quiet hum of the machines monitoring her vitals. It felt like a moment suspended in time, a fragile truce between two people who had once shared a life but had been torn apart by lies. As I sat there, I realized that in some ways I had already begun to forgive her, not because she deserved it, but because I needed to let go. I needed to move on, not just from Willa, but from the past that had haunted me for so long. After a while, Willa's eyes began to droop, and I could see the exhaustion weighing her down. She was fading, and I knew she didn't have much time left. I should go, I said quietly, standing up from the chair. You need your rest. Willa nodded weakly, her eyes barely open. Thank you for coming, she whispered, her voice faint. I stood there for a moment, looking down at her. The woman lying in that bed was a far cry from the Willa I had once known, but in that moment, I saw her for what she truly was, a flawed, broken person who had made mistakes but was trying to make amends before it was too late. Without another word, I turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind me. The drive home was a blur. My mind was filled with a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, relief, and something else I couldn't quite put into words. Seeing Willa again had stirred up so much inside me, and yet there was a strange sense of closure too. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally start to move on. When I pulled into the driveway, Jody was waiting for me on the porch, her arms crossed as she watched me step out of the truck. I walked over to her, my heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. How did it go? She asked gently, reaching out to take my hand. I let out a long breath, squeezing her hand in return. It's over, I said quietly. I think I finally got what I needed. Jody smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. I'm glad, she said, wrapping her arms around me and pulling me close. You deserve to let go of all that. As I stood there, holding the woman who had helped me rebuild my life, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The past had finally been laid to rest, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Willa had made her amends, and I had made mine. And now, it was time to move forward. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking less and less about Willa. The weight of her betrayal no longer felt like an anchor dragging me down. Instead, I focused on my life here, with Jody and the kids, the life I had built from the ground up. There was still work to be done, but for the first time, I felt like I was finally free. It was about a week later when I got the call from the hospital. Willa had passed away in the early hours of the morning, peaceful and surrounded by what little family she had left. The nurse on the phone told me that Willa had asked for me before she died, but by the time they tried to reach me, it was too late. I thanked the nurse and hung up the phone, sitting there in the quiet of my office. There was a part of me that wished I had been there at the end, to see her one last time. But then, I realized that I had already said my goodbyes. I had gotten the closure I needed, and Willa had found her peace. As I sat there, the sun streaming through the window, I felt a strange sense of finality. The chapter of my life that had been tied to Willa was finally closed, and now I could move on. With a deep breath, I stood up and walked outside, the warm breeze carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass. Jody was in the yard with the kids, laughing as they chased each other around. I watched them for a moment, my heart swelling with gratitude for the life I had now. I walked over to Jody, wrapping my arms around her from behind and kissing her cheek. She smiled, leaning into me as we watched the kids play. "Everything okay?" she asked, glancing up at me. "Yeah," I said, nodding. "Everything's okay now." And for the first time in years, I truly meant it.